Chapter 1. Savannah, Georgia. Philandros Landros Myers stood across the street from a large row house. He'd been doing as much for nearly 2 hours and planned to continue for several more. For 2 weeks, he'd found himself paying visits to the location almost nightly. The only thing that had kept him away briefly was an overnight trip out of town that had been needed for work. As a paranormal security and intelligence agency operative, PSI op, he was often required to travel. His home base was Savannah, Georgia, but that hadn't always been the case. America was relatively new for him, considering he'd only been living in it for around 50 or 60 years, give or take a few. Before America, he'd mostly been stationed out of headquarters in Europe and Asia. As one of the founding members of PSI, Landros tended to have his pick of locations as well as teams. It had been his choice to come to the United States. He'd hoped that by putting distance between himself and his past, he could avoid having history repeat itself. So far, his move had paid off. Everyone he loved was safe, at least for now. Recent events had left his niece, who had occupied the row house he now stood before and whom he saw more as a daughter, moving from Savannah to an area just north of Richmond, Virginia. That meant she was an 8-hour car drive from him, or an hour-and-a-half flight. He missed having her close, knowing she was minutes away, but that wasn't what had drawn him to the row house. At least he didn't think so. As he stood there, continuing to stare at the home, he wasn't entirely sure why he kept feeling pulled back to the location, or why he was logging so many hours outside of it. Night had done nothing to lower the temperature or the humidity that hung in the air, making it feel heavy. He was used to it, having called Savannah home for just over 20 years. Before that, he'd lived in New Orleans. Since he tended to run on the cool side, no matter what time of the year it was, he preferred the warmth the South offered. The lowest level door to the home was green and partially obscured by thick ivy that covered the brick walls flanking both sides of the door. The ivy then crept around and up the front of the home. A large black trash can sat to the right of the door. A 6-foot iron fence encased the home with a gate out front. The main entrance was up one level, with a beautiful exterior staircase and porch that was accessible from the single-car driveway. The main entrance was hardly ever used by the home's occupants. In fact, he couldn't recall them ever mentioning even opening that door. The home was a place Landros knew well. After all, he was the homeowner. It was one of the many he owned. His main home was within the historic district as well, sitting across from Forsyth Park. The row house wasn't quite as large as his estate, which boasted 8 bedrooms and 11 bathrooms, but it more than fit 2 young women. He'd purchased the property for his niece when she'd wanted to move onto campus to attend university several years back. The idea of her being in dorm rooms where he was sure nothing but orgies took place had left his inner darkness unsettled. When he'd stressed his issues with the dorms to his niece, Nicolette, she'd heard him out, all the while looking as though she was doing her best to avoid laughing. She'd then offered to find a small efficiency apartment just off campus, one she could share with her best friend, Clara Reed. Landros had nixed that idea as well, wanting his niece closer to him while still giving her some semblance of independence. Since she'd refused to live in the carriage home on his estate, he'd done the next best thing and found the row house within the same district of the city. Landros had more money than he could ever dream of spending. It was difficult for him to understand the lure of the apartment or the idea that Nicolette had craved living on her own, away from his homes. He didn't think he ran too strict of a house. His main rule had always been no boys, ever. He wished that rule was still being enforced. Since Nicolette was newly mated to a man he considered a friend, Landros had slight guilt about his views on the matter. Garth Ingerson, the man who was for all intents and purposes married to his niece, was a good and honorable man. One who had hailed from the Viking age of Scandinavia and who had warrior in his blood, a man who could and would protect Nicolette from the evils of the world. That didn't change the fact Garth was a man, with all his male bits intact. The idea of Nicolette being intimate with anyone set Landros's darkness on the edge of breaking free. As a vampire, he had to be mindful of his demon. It was stronger than most. It had to be. Had it been only average demon strength, which was quite powerful in itself, the demon wouldn't have been able to overpower the Fey part of him, something that came from his father's side. That, combined with the gifts he'd gotten from his mother, who had been one of the Pythia in ancient Greece, meant Landros had been born with gifts that far exceeded the gifts of those around him. As an oracle of Delphi, his mother had a direct link to the gods. He'd grown up in a time when those around him believed fully in magic and gods and in monsters, unlike today where nearly everyone wrote it all off as nothing more than myths and legends. In his day and age, humans feared the supernatural and worshipped it. He'd been born in Hellas, or the Greece of old, Attica to be exact. His father's largest estate had been in Athens, where Landros had spent a portion of his youth before his mother had insisted that he be sent to live among the Spartans until he was 20 years of age. Since Laconia and Attica often stood in opposition to one another, his father had not been on board with the idea to start with. It wasn't until his mother said, "The gods willed it so," that Landros was sent off, barely 7 years of age, to be trained and treated as if he were Spartan by birth. To this day, Landros wasn't sure how his father had managed to persuade the Spartans to accept him into their fold. However, accept was a strong word. Most looked down upon him. They saw him as less than them because they knew the truth, that he was not one of their own. As a small boy, he'd not yet come into his powers or even fully understood what his parents had been. All he'd thought was that they did not want him, that he wasn't enough, that shame had driven them to send him to live in Laconia. The Spartans were harder on him than on their own, and it wasn't as if they were known to go easy on anyone. For years, he'd hated his parents for subjecting him to the brutal upbringing, while his peers in Athens lived what looked to be a charmed life in comparison. His own sister, whose name he'd tweaked slightly and given to his niece, had been held in high regard at their home, something that wasn't entirely common in Athens back in his day. Women in Athens did not hold the same weight and power as their Spartan counterparts, but his sister had been the apple of his father's eye. Younger than Landros by 14 years, their age gap was significant. She'd been born when he was off training with the Spartans. By that point, he'd already spent 7 years enduring the hell around him and was barely 14, yet hardened to the realities of war and death. He couldn't help but be jealous. Harboring ill will toward a small child he'd never even met had eaten at him. He'd spent another 6 years beyond that with the Spartans, until the day of his 20th birthday, when he found himself being cast from their midst and sent home to Athens. He'd left Athens a boy of 7 and returned a man of 20, to a family he barely knew or recognized anymore, and the disdain he'd felt for his sister faded the moment he'd laid eyes upon her. She'd been 6 years old when he'd first met her. She'd had huge brown eyes and a head of wavy dark brown curls that bounced as she ran. While other women who resided within the grounds of his father's estate looked upon him as if he was a stranger, no longer one of them, his sister stared at him with nothing short of adoration and love in her eyes. She had apparently begged to hear stories of him from their mother, and he learned she'd idolized him from a very early age. It was hard to be jealous of her when she was so full of unconditional love for him. Before he knew it, he found that she'd managed to worm her way into his hardened heart. In many ways, he began to view her as a daughter despite the fact he was only 14 years older. His sister kept him grounded within a city he no longer felt at home. Friends whom he'd had as a child were no more than names and faces to him as an adult male. He was a warrior, battle-tested and ready for war. They were soft, spoiled, and pampered. They enjoyed taunting him with their superior educations, always wanting to have a battle of wits because a hand-to-hand match would have seen them defeated with ease. They'd spent their youths with tutors and being groomed for high society. He'd spent his in hell. They'd been forged in two very different fires. He'd known nothing but hardship and endurance. Next to them, he was stone, an emotionless void in comparison. At first, their sneers and taunts had gotten to him. But he had shown them. He'd sought out the finest of tutors and devoured everything he could, learning from the greats along the way. He may have had a later start in life with an education, but that had not taken from his ability to learn. He soaked in everything he could, becoming versed in multiple languages and being able to hold his own with philosophers who would later go down in history as masters of their craft. And during that time frame, his sister had grown into an amazing young woman, one who, like many women in that day and age, found herself wed early. The match had been a good one, and his sister had known real love from her husband. When news that his sister was expecting a child of her own had reached Landros, he was on the battlefront, preparing to stand against the Persian army. He'd been happy for his sister, but worried, as childbirth was dangerous and she was young. But he'd pushed aside his fears and focused on the task at hand, defeating an enemy of Athens. And Persia had been the ultimate enemy back then. Shared hate of the empire had been the catalyst the city-states of Greece needed to work together when they'd spent so long fighting amongst themselves. And it was that shared hate that forged lasting friendships with men he was still close to today. It didn't matter how much time had spanned since the wars of old. Immortality had a way of making time irrelevant. And the losses he'd suffered at the hands of one Persian in particular were still as fresh today as they had been thousands of years ago. Mirza had been unlike anything or anyone Landros had ever encountered. To this day, he couldn't fathom what had drawn the man to him. All he knew was that he'd found himself the center of Mirza's attention, and with it came nothing but death and darkness. Life with the Spartans had prepared him for war, but it had not readied him for battle with evil, with a demon so vicious and so focused that eternity didn't seem long enough to break his grip. Living in the past was something Landros swore he'd not revert to, but it was hard. The last week had proven more complicated than most. Dreams had haunted him, bringing with them memories best left buried deep down. More than once he'd dreamed of Mirza, whom he had not seen in hundreds of years, being here in Savannah. At first, the dreams had felt so real, so alarming, that Landros had woken and instantly gone on the hunt for the male. Tracking an original demon, one who had been born from the first darkness that was whispered of in nearly every religion out there, was easier said than done. But Landros had thousands of years of experience. He found no signs of Mirza in the area, and that should have been enough to set Landros's mind at ease. It wasn't. He still couldn't shake the feeling his maker, the man who had turned him into a vampire, was close, and that he was still a threat. That the monster was coming once again to murder all those Landros held near and dear, as he'd done centuries ago. Lowering his head, Landros touched his temple, trying to will away the memory of the carnage he'd returned home to find on the night he'd been sired against his will. To the end of days, he'd never forget the sight of his parents, sister, and her husband slaughtered. By the gods' grace, his sister's child had been spared. The baby had been hours old and had only lived because a household servant had taken the babe to be washed and tended to, allowing his sister time to rest. That meant the child had not been within the main dwelling at the time the devil himself had shown. The baby had not been there when Mirza had taken it upon himself to rid Landros of his human ties, to wipe out his entire family so he could concentrate on being one with his newly acquired demon side, so he could embrace the darkness, and forego all past relationships and concerns. In one fateful night, Landros had lost his life and his entire family, and found himself sharing his body with a demon. It had taken everything he had not to give in to the blood that had been everywhere upon his return home. He could still smell it to this very day. Horror had gripped the human side of him, but hunger had beat at the vampire portion. The demon within him, which was powerful, wanted to feast in the aftermath and bathe in the carnage. It had nearly done just that until Landros had found his sister's dead body. Seeing the one person he'd ever truly cared about dead had been enough for him to hang on and deny the demon in him what it wanted most, and it had given him just enough willpower to seek out his sister's baby and take it to safety. Far from him, far from Mirza. The child had grown into an adult and had a child of its own. Shortly thereafter, Mirza had found them, and Landros had barely managed to get the newest baby to safety, hiding it away so that it could grow to be an adult and have children of its own. The cycle continued, with Mirza finding each member of his family line and killing them. Finally, Landros had realized he had to put as much distance between himself and his family line as possible. He'd made the choice to cut any and all ties with the past. It wasn't until 20 years ago that he'd found himself crossing paths with someone from his line once more, Nicolette. He'd found it impossible to abandon her in her hour of need, and instead of sending her away to be raised by humans as he'd done to all from his line in the past, he'd kept her with him, raising her himself.